Commander Jack Lucky Sterling stood before the mirror in his quarters aboard the Galactic Council Station, straightening his diplomatic uniform for the third time. The irony of his nickname wasn't lost on him. He'd earned it after surviving 17 different diplomatic incidents, 3 ship explosions, and 1 particularly aggressive alien houseplant. The fact that he kept walking away from disasters had convinced everyone he was lucky. The fact that he kept ending up in disasters in the first place suggested otherwise. Commander Sterling, his AI assistant, chirped through the room's speakers. "You have 17 minutes until the council session begins. Would you like me to recite the emergency protocols again?" "No thanks," Dave Sterling sighed, adjusting his collar. "I've memorized all 37 ways to avoid causing an interplanetary incident by accidentally showing the wrong number of teeth while smiling." Dave's voice carried what Sterling swore was a hint of disappointment. "There are actually 38 protocols now, sir. The Zelaxians recently added one about the proper way to sneeze in their presence. Apparently they consider it a marriage proposal." Fantastic. Sterling grabbed his datapad and headed for the door. "Any other last-minute ways I might accidentally start a war or get engaged?" "Well, sir, there are the new guidelines about proper tentacle-shaking etiquette with the—" That was rhetorical, Dave. The corridors of the Galactic Council Station were their usual chaos of different atmospheric requirements, gravitational preferences, and translation devices all trying to coexist in the same space. Sterling ducked under a floating Medusan ambassador, or possibly a lost party balloon, it was always hard to tell with them, sidestepped a group of methane-breathing chlorics, and managed to reach the council chamber with 5 minutes to spare. The chamber itself was a testament to the galaxy's determination to make democracy as complicated as possible. Hundreds of different environmental bubbles housed representatives from across known space, each one carefully calibrated to their specific needs. Some were filled with exotic gases, others with various liquids, and at least one contained what appeared to be living jello. Sterling made his way to the human section, nodding to Counselor Pip as he passed. The tiny green alien, barely reaching Sterling's knee, gave what might have been a wave with one of their 17 appendages. After 3 years on the council, Sterling still wasn't sure which end of Pip was the front. "Ah, Commander Sterling," a dry, academic voice called out. Sterling turned to see Vezene, the council's historian, floating in their anti-gravity pod. The ancient alien looked like what would happen if an octopus decided to become a university professor, complete with what Sterling swore was a tweed-textured epidermis. Professor Sterling nodded. "Looking forward to another exciting session of interstellar bureaucracy." Vezene's tentacles rippled in what Sterling had learned was their species' equivalent of an eye roll. "Oh yes, absolutely thrilling. I particularly enjoy watching species that haven't even mastered faster-than-light travel argue about proper waste management protocols for quantum singularities." Sterling was about to respond when the chamber's lights dimmed, signaling the start of the session. As representatives settled into their various environmental bubbles, the council president's hologram materialized in the center of the room. President Loquar, a crystalline being who communicated through patterns of light, began the session with the traditional 12-hour recitation of the council's founding principles. Sterling settled in for the long haul, pulling up his datapad's game of space solitaire. He was just about to beat his high score when an alert flashed across his screen. His blood ran cold as he read the message. Priority alert: new species requesting council representation, the Kronax Empire. Current status demanding immediate audience. Threat assessment high. Diplomatic incidents in last cycle 47. Notable characteristics: extremely militant. Poor sense of humor. Well, Sterling muttered to himself, there goes my quiet day of bureaucratic tedium. The chamber doors burst open with a dramatic whoosh, and a delegation of what appeared to be 8-foot-tall humanoid lizards in Baroque military uniforms stormed in. Their scales gleamed under the chamber lights, polished to a mirror shine that matched their ceremonial armor. Sterling noticed something odd as the Kronax delegation made their way to the center of the chamber. The other council members, particularly the older species, were reacting strangely. The Medusan ambassador had turned a peculiar shade of puce. Counselor Pip had retracted all 17 appendages. Even Vezene's tentacles had gone completely still, something Sterling had never seen before. But what really caught his attention was the way they were all looking at him. Not with their usual mixture of confusion and mild concern, but with something that looked almost like pity? The lead Kronax, a particularly impressive specimen with crimson scales and more metals than seemed physically possible to earn in one lifetime, stepped forward. His translator crackled to life, broadcasting his words in the standard council frequency. I am General K. Thor of the Kronax Empire, he announced, managing to sound both regal and threatening at the same time. We claim our rightful place in this council, and we will not be denied. Any who oppose us will face the consequences. K. Thor's eyes locked onto Sterling, and a predatory smile spread across his reptilian features, starting with removing these humans from their undeserved seat of power. The chamber erupted in whispers. Sterling noticed that several species had activated their emergency environmental shields, something usually reserved for imminent environmental catastrophes or particularly contentious budget meetings. Oh dear, Vezana muttered from their pod. They really shouldn't have done that. Sterling couldn't help but agree. His legendary bad luck had struck again, and somehow he knew this was going to be a very, very long day. General K. Thor's proclamation hung in the air like a bad smell in a broken environmental bubble. Sterling noticed that the council chamber's artificial gravity seemed to get heavier with tension, though that might have been the graviton delegation stress shedding again. I repeat, K. Thor announced, somehow managing to look down his snout at everyone despite several species being physically higher in the chamber. The Kronax Empire demands the human seat on this council. We are clearly the superior species. Sterling raised his hand. Point of order. K. Thor's tail twitched. The human dares to speak. Well, yes, that's generally how these things work, Sterling replied, consulting his datapad. According to Council Regulation 7249B, subsection Q, paragraph 437, any species challenging for a council seat must first submit their application in triplicate, attend no fewer than 15 cultural sensitivity seminars, and provide proof of achievement in at least 3 of the following categories: faster than light travel, unified planetary government, peaceful first contact resolution, or winning an intergalactic baking contest. He looked up. I don't suppose you brought any cupcakes. The general's scales flushed a deeper red. You dare mock the mighty Kronax Empire? We have conquered 12 star systems. Our military might is unmatched in our sector. From their anti-gravity pod, Vez-Na made a sound that Sterling had learned was their species' equivalent of clearing their throat. General K. Thor, perhaps we should discuss this in a more private setting. There are certain historical factors you might want to consider before. Silence. K. Thor's tail lashed back and forth. We will not be deterred by bureaucratic nonsense or cryptic warnings. The Kronax Empire demands trial by combat for the human seat. The chamber erupted in chaos. Several species simultaneously activated their panic bubbles. The Medusan ambassador actually fainted, floating gently to the ceiling. Councillor Pip had turned a fascinating shade of chartreuse. Sterling pinched the bridge of his nose. General, trial by combat was outlawed by Council Resolution 8876C after the infamous tap dancing incident of 2218. I'm not legally allowed to discuss the details, but let's just say the cleanup crews are still finding sequins. Then we will take the seat by force, K. Thor declared, reaching for what appeared to be a ceremonial weapon. The reaction from the council was immediate and surprising. Instead of panic, there was a sudden, deafening silence. Every single species in the chamber had backed away from both the Kronax delegation and the human section, creating a conspicuous empty space in the middle of the room. President Locor's crystalline form had shifted to a color that Sterling had never seen before, something between oh no and not again on the electromagnetic spectrum. Vezana's tentacles were now moving in what Sterling recognized as their equivalent of a facepalm. General K. Thor, they said, their academic tone carrying an edge of exasperation. Are you familiar with the Galactic Historical Archives, specifically the section labeled Why We Don't Provoke the Humans, a Comprehensive Guide? Bah. Human propaganda. Actually, Sterling interjected, I've never seen that section. Oddly enough, every time I try to access it, I get redirected to cat videos. Vesna's skin shifted to a deeper shade of tweed. Yes, well, there's a reason for that. Perhaps, General, you'd like to hear about the last time someone declared war on humanity? It's quite an interesting story. K. Thor sneered. What could be so special about these soft, scale-less creatures? A ripple of what could only be described as collective galactic PTSD went through the chamber. Several species began spontaneously evacuating their environmental bubbles. You know what Sterling said, leaning back in his chair. I'd actually like to hear this story too. Everyone gets weird whenever it comes up, but nobody ever wants to explain why. Vesna's tentacles curled in what might have been a smile. Well then, let me tell you about the incident that made the galaxy decide that maybe, just maybe, humans should be left alone. Sterling couldn't help but notice that K-Thor's scales had lost some of their shine, especially after 3 different species simultaneously activated their emergency translocation devices and vanished from the chamber. Whatever this story was, it was clearly going to be interesting. He just hoped it wouldn't end with him having to fill out another 17 forms explaining how he'd accidentally started an interstellar incident. Again, Vézinet's anti-gravity pods settled into what Sterling had come to think of as their lecture mode position, slightly tilted, tentacles clasped professionally in front of them, skin taking on the distinct pattern of elbow patches. The year was 2218 by your Earth calendar, they began, their voice taking on the tone of a tenure track professor who'd had too much coffee. Humanity had just achieved faster-than-light travel and was, shall we say, enthusiastically exploring the galaxy. You mean stumbling around like drunken Zarthians during mating season, Counselor Pip muttered. Yes, well, Vézinet continued, humanity's first contact with the Drachnid collective was unique. Sterling raised an eyebrow. I've never heard of the Drachnids. There's a reason for that, Vézinet replied dryly. You see, the Drachnids were much like our friends the Chronax here, militaristic, expansionist, absolutely convinced of their own superiority. They took one look at Earth's transmission signals and decided that humanity would make an excellent addition to their empire. As they should have, K-Thor interrupted, though Sterling noticed his tail was twitching nervously. Any superior species has the right. General Vézinet's tentacles rippled in irritation. Please don't interrupt. I'm having war flashbacks to my teaching days. The historian's pod drifted closer to the center of the chamber, where a holographic display flickered to life. The Drachnids sent their most impressive fleet to Earth. 300 ships, each the size of a small moon. They deployed their standard intimidation tactics, positioning their fleet in a threatening formation, broadcasting their demands in every frequency, and launching what they called their demonstration of power. The hologram showed massive ships arranged in a precise geometric pattern above a blue-green planet. And K-Thor demanded, though his scales had taken on a distinctly pale hue. And Vézinet continued, humanity responded in a way that, well, let's just say it changed galactic military doctrine forever. You see, they had appointed an unusual military strategist to handle the situation, Admiral Helena Drake. The hologram shifted to show a human woman in a military uniform, looking thoroughly unimpressed with everything around her. Sterling noticed she was holding what appeared to be a rubber duck. Admiral Drake had a unique approach to warfare, Vézinet explained. The Drachnids expected the humans to either surrender immediately or attempt some sort of noble but futile resistance. Instead, they got Operation Rubber Duck. Operation what now? Sterling and K-Thor asked simultaneously. Perhaps. Vézinet suggested, their tentacles curling with what might have been suppressed amusement. It would be better to show you the classified footage. I should warn you, what you're about to see has been used as a cautionary tale in every major military academy in the galaxy for the past 50 years. The hologram flickered again, and Sterling leaned forward, finally about to learn why the galaxy treated humans like that one cousin nobody talks about, but everyone's slightly afraid of at family reunions. Behind him, he heard several species activating their emotional support bubbles. The hologram expanded to fill the center of the council chamber, showing the massive Drachnid fleet in all its glory. The ships were sleek, dangerous, and covered in enough weapons to make a Death Star feel inadequate. The Drachnids, Vézinet narrated, their tentacles gesturing at the display, had expected humanity to respond according to their carefully calculated predictions. They had run 10,000 simulations. They had prepared for every known form of warfare. The footage showed the Drachnid fleet receiving Earth's response, a single small ship, barely the size of a courier vessel. Is that? K-Thor squinted at the image. Is that ship broadcasting something on all frequencies? Indeed, it was, Vézinet confirmed. Specifically, it was broadcasting what humans call elevator music. I believe the song was The Girl from Ipanema. Sterling couldn't help but grin. Let me guess, Admiral Drake. The very same. You see, while the Drachnids were busy being confused by the music, they failed to notice that the small ship had released several thousand seemingly harmless objects into space. Objects that, upon closer inspection by the Drachnid scanners, appeared to be rubber ducks. Sterling finished, everything suddenly clicking into place. She filled space with rubber ducks. Precisely. Yellow, squeaky, and completely innocent-looking rubber ducks. The Drachnids were perplexed. Their military doctrine had no protocols for dealing with floating bath toys. and while they were trying to determine if the rubber ducks were some kind of advanced weapon, the hologram showed the Drachnid ships suddenly being swarmed by what appeared to be thousands of small, maneuverable craft. Phase 2 of Operation Rubber Duck Vezene continued. You see, while the Drachnids were distracted by the ducks, Earth launched their actual attack fleet. But instead of military vessels they sent, are those modified civilian shipping containers, K. Thor asked, his voice rising several octaves. Indeed. Humanity had taken their basic cargo containers, strapped engines to them, and filled them with what they called a bunch of random stuff we found in Florida. The Drachnid fleet, programmed to respond to military threats, literally didn't know how to react to being attacked by weaponized junk. The hologram showed chaos erupting across the Drachnid fleet as the container ships deployed their payloads. Sterling watched in amazement as space itself seemed to fill with an impossible variety of objects. Is that an alligator in a spacesuit? He asked, squinting at the display. Yes, Vezene replied. Apparently it was the Florida Space Force's mascot, named Dave. The footage continued, showing the Drachnid ships trying to target the swarm of containers while simultaneously dealing with rubber ducks that had somehow magnetized themselves to their sensor arrays. Meanwhile, the girl from Ipanema continued to play on all frequencies. But the true genius of Admiral Drake's plan, Vezene continued, their tentacles moving excitedly, was Phase 3. You see, while the Drachnids were distracted by the ducks and the containers, they didn't notice that humanity had reprogrammed all their maintenance robots with. Please don't say it, K. Thor whispered. Dance protocols, Vezene confirmed. Specifically, synchronized disco dancing. Every maintenance robot on every Drachnid ship suddenly stopped what they were doing and began performing an elaborate choreography to stay alive. The hologram showed the interior of a Drachnid ship, where dozens of maintenance robots had formed a conga line through the engine room. The Drachnid commanders couldn't restore control, Vezene explained. Their entire fleet was slowly being transformed into an impromptu disco party. And then, just when they thought it couldn't get worse, the rubber ducks started singing, Sterling guessed. The rubber ducks started singing, Vezene confirmed. In perfect harmony. A medley of Earth's most annoying advertising jingles. The hologram showed the final moments of the battle, if it could even be called that. The mighty Drachnid fleet, reduced to chaos by rubber ducks, disco-dancing robots, and weaponized Florida memorabilia, finally surrendered. Not because they were defeated militarily, but because their entire command structure had collapsed into helpless confusion. And that, Vezene concluded, their tentacles making a gesture that universally meant tada da, is why the galaxy decided that perhaps it would be better to just let humans have a seat on the council. After all, any species that can win a war through synchronized disco and rubber ducks is probably best kept where we can keep an eye on them. Sterling looked around the chamber. The other council members were nodding sagely, while K. Thor's scales had turned an interesting shade of green. So Sterling said, turning to the Chronax general with a smile, about that trial by combat. General K. Thor stood frozen in the council chamber, his magnificent military posture suddenly resembling someone who'd just realized they'd left their quantum stove on at home. His tail, previously lashing with aggressive confidence, now drooped like overcooked spaghetti. Surely, he managed, his translator struggling to convey the right mix of denial and dawning horror. Surely this is an exaggeration. No species would wage war so. Creatively, Sterling suggested helpfully. Insanely, K. Thor exploded. It defies all military logic, all strategic doctrine. All he paused, noticing that several of his own officers had begun slowly backing away from him. Oh, but that's not even the best part, Vezene continued, their tentacles wiggling with what could only be described as academic glee. Should I tell them about what happened after the surrender, Commander Sterling? Sterling spread his hands. Please do. I'm learning so much about my own species today. Well, Vezene's pod did a little spin that Sterling had come to recognize as their equivalent of barely contained amusement. After the Drachnids surrendered, humanity didn't demand territories or resources. Instead, they insisted on what they called cultural exchange programs. K. Thor's scales rippled. Cultural exchange. Indeed. Within 6 months, the formerly militant Drachnid collective had developed an obsession with Earth soap operas, started a galaxy-wide chain of combination taco sushi restaurants, and became the leading exporters of novelty t-shirts reading "I survived Operation Rubber Duck and all I got was this lousy shirt." The hologram showed images of Drachnid warriors in Hawaiian shirts, operating food trucks, The final blow to their military reputation, Vezina continued, came when they converted their largest battleship into what they called a spring break party cruise. Sterling couldn't help himself. What happened to the Drachnids after that? Oh, they're still around, Vezina replied. They run the galaxy's most successful chain of themed entertainment establishments. The Rubber Duck Disco franchise is particularly popular. I believe they just opened their 1,000th location. K. Thor looked like he was having trouble processing this information. His mighty claws, previously clenched in threatening gestures, now fidgeted with his metals. But the general sputtered, "You're so squishy and primitive, you don't even have proper scales." True, Sterling nodded. We also invented something called reality television and thought it was a good idea to make multiple Fast and Furious movies. Nobody's perfect. The council chamber had grown very quiet. Even the environmental bubbles seemed to be holding their breath. Perhaps President Locor's crystalline form suggested diplomatically, their light patterns suggesting barely suppressed amusement, the Kronax Empire would like to revise their earlier demands. K. Thor's officers were now actively trying to pull him toward the exit. But what about our military might? K. Thor protested weakly. Our superior tactical doctrine. General Sterling said kindly, reaching into his pocket, "Would you like to see something interesting?" The entire chamber tensed. Several species activated their emergency shields. Counselor Pip's 17 appendages all crossed themselves simultaneously. Sterling pulled out a small yellow object. A small yellow rubber object. An object that, when squeezed, made a very distinct squeaking noise. The effect was immediate. K. Thor's scales went from green to white faster than a chameleon at a disco. His officers abandoned all pretense of dignity and began sprinting for the exit. "That's," K. Thor pointed a trembling claw at the duck. "That's just a toy. A harmless toy." Sterling squeezed it again. The duck squeaked cheerfully. "Is it though?" he asked, smiling. "Is it really?" The council chamber had fallen into the kind of silence usually reserved for quantum libraries and awkward family dinners. General K. Thor, the mighty leader of the Kronax Empire, stood frozen in place, his eyes locked on Sterling's rubber duck like it might suddenly sprout antimatter engines and start dancing. "I think," K. Thor said carefully, his translator struggling to maintain his dignity, "that the Kronax Empire would like to revise our previous statement." Oh, Sterling squeezed the duck again, causing several species to dive for cover. "Yes," K. Thor continued, backing slowly toward the door. "Upon careful consideration, we believe that perhaps the current council arrangement is satisfactory." Splendid President Locar's crystalline form sparkled with what might have been relief. "Then shall we return to our original agenda? I believe we were discussing waste management protocols for quantum singularities." "Actually," K. Thor said quickly, "the Kronax Empire suddenly remembers a very urgent matter that requires our immediate attention, several light years away, possibly in another galaxy." Sterling watched with amusement as the mighty Kronax delegation attempted to exit the chamber with dignity while simultaneously trying to break the land speed record for diplomatic retreats. "Oh," and General Sterling called after them. K. Thor froze mid-stride. "You might want to check your ship's maintenance robots before you leave. They've been acting a bit strange." The sound of a Kronax general breaking into a full sprint while wearing ceremonial armor would go down in council history as one of the more entertaining moments in galactic politics. As the chamber settled back into its normal chaos of environmental bubbles and translation devices, Sterling turned to Vezina. "You know," he said, "I can't help but notice that humanity's legendary bad luck with first contacts might have actually been good luck in disguise." Vezina's tentacles rippled thoughtfully. "Indeed. Though I suspect Admiral Drake's success had less to do with luck and more to do with understanding something fundamental about the galaxy." "Oh. Yes, you see, most species approach warfare with complex strategies and advanced technologies, but humanity, their tentacles curled in what was definitely amusement. Humanity understood that sometimes the best weapon is pure, weapons-grade confusion." Sterling looked down at his rubber duck. "So that's why everyone gets nervous when humans start getting creative." "Precisely. After Operation Rubber Duck, the galaxy realized that any species that could weaponize novelty toys and disco dancing was capable of literally anything. Peace through mutual bafflement, you might say. As if to prove the point, somewhere in the distance they could hear the faint but unmistakable opening notes of the girl from Ipanema drifting through the station's communication systems. The Kronax delegation's screams of panic provided a unique counterpoint to the melody. Commander Sterling, Dave's voice came through his communicator. Should I inform the Kronax that their maintenance robots aren't actually programmed to dance? They appear to be having some sort of mass anxiety attack. Sterling smiled, pocketing his rubber duck. No, Dave, I think we'll let them sweat it out a bit longer. Sometimes the threat of disco is more powerful than disco itself. Around the chamber, the various council members were returning to their normal activities, though Sterling noticed they were giving him a bit more personal space than usual. Councillor Pip had even stopped trying to figure out which end was their front. You know what the really funny part is, Sterling said to Vez N.A. as they watched the council resume its normal proceedings. What's that? That rubber duck I showed K. Thor? I actually just bought it this morning from the Drachnid gift shop on level 7. It plays Dancing Queen when you squeeze it underwater. Vesne's skin shifted to what Sterling now recognized as their version of a grin. Perhaps we should keep that detail out of the official records. Agreed. Speaking of records, Sterling pulled up his datapad. I suppose I should start filling out the paperwork for accidentally averting an interstellar incident. Actually, Vez ENA's tentacles wiggled with satisfaction. I believe this qualifies as successfully completing a cultural exchange program. Much less paperwork. Sterling looked around the council chamber at the species that had gone from seeing humans as a potential threat to seeing them as that one unpredictable friend who might do literally anything at any moment, but whom you definitely want on your side when things get weird. You know what he said, settling back into his chair as President Loquar began the afternoon session's 12-hour recitation of procedural guidelines. I think humanity's bad luck might actually be the galaxy's good fortune. Somewhere in the distance, a rubber duck squeaked in agreement,